Well, hello, Abundant Life Church and all of our online tribe. I am so sorry we have had an extreme amount of technical difficulties getting this started tonight. I believe that I am live. It says that I am, but for whatever reason, YouTube is blacked out. And so I think you're seeing me. And if you are seeing me right now, will you just make a little comment over in the chat box if you can and just say, yes, I can see you? It's completely blank on my side. They did some kind of an update today, and when I tried it earlier today, it worked, and now it's not. But I just want to know that you can see me. I see that Carl Van Waters is online. Carl, if you can let me know if you can see me. Carl says you can see me, so I'm going to do this from my perspective in the dark. So I hope that you have been able to find this video. Again, I am so sorry for the technical difficulties. I have no idea what was going on. YouTube kept knocking me out and wouldn't let me stay signed in, and just a lot going on. So I apologize for that. I'm hoping that one or two others will be able to find this real soon. The numbers are real low on those that are watching because we could not use the same link for the other one. So there was a lot of trouble with this. So I do apologize for that. But I hope the numbers are starting to go up. So some of you must be able to have figured it out that we were having technical difficulties and got back with us. Hey, let's jump right into our study tonight because we're already a few minutes late with all the technical difficulties going on. I'm so glad that you're here. So glad that you've joined us. We will send out this video as a link and an email tomorrow to all of our online, all of those that are on our notification email list, because obviously having this kind of technical difficulties, our numbers are low enough. I could tell that some people probably weren't able to find us after we had to restart a new live broadcast. So I do apologize for that. I want to jump right in tonight to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. I hope you got the study guide. That's going to help you out a lot. This is going to be another one of those parts in the book of Acts, and we'll have one more lesson left in the book of Acts next week, Acts chapter 28, which, oh, by the way, next week after that will be our summer pause. So we're perfect timing. We're going to end out on the book of Acts, have our summer pause. And then when we pick up again later, late summer, early fall, then you and I will be in a new series. Okay. Acts chapter 27, we're going to be talking about Paul navigating the storms. Paul is, you remember the background, Paul was falsely accused. He was brought before the local proconsul there in Jerusalem. He gave a great testimony to who Jesus Christ is. Then he said that he appealed to Caesar. And so now they've got to get him to Rome to go to Caesar. So we see here beginning in verse number 1 that Paul is boarding a ship and he's getting ready to travel to Rome so that he can appear before Caesar there. Okay. So that's the background of where we're at. And so let's just pick it up and read here beginning in chapter 27. And what we're going to do is we're going to read and study it together, just going through the verses together. Then at the very end, I'm going to wrap it up with three lessons that we learn at the end. And that's where for the lack of a better term, the teaching gold is going to be is at the very end of this lesson tonight, because we're going to apply truths from the story that we've just learned from. Okay. So there's two segments in here that I wanted you to see. First of all, we're going to look at the first 12 verses where we're seeing where Paul is traveling from Caesarea to a place called Fair Havens. Okay. To Fair Havens. All right. And then beginning verse number 13, that will be the second part. And that'll be Paul's stormy journey from Fair Havens to Malta. So we're going to see Paul going from Caesarea to Fair Havens. And then the second segment would be Fair Havens to Malta. Malta is where this chapter ends. Still not at Rome, but we will leave chapter 28 for next week. Okay, let's read verses 1 and 2 here. Paul traveling from Caesarea to Fair Havens. It says, and when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So, entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So here we see that Paul is now being boarded onto this ship. He and a number of other prisoners, actually, it says there for us. And he was given over to one named Julius, a centurion from the Augustan regiment. And so this much we know. We know from later on in the chapter, and we'll get to that later, there are 276 people aboard this ship. Of those 276, some that we know of is Paul the Apostle. We know about Julian the centurion. We also know that it specifically mentions here in verse number 2 that with them also was Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So who is the us? That's Luke. Luke is recording this. He's traveling with Paul to Rome, recording all of this along the way, and there are 276 of them on this ship. Okay, let's continue verse number 3 to verse number 8. This is where Paul actually now is setting sail from Caesarea. We're going to read verses 3 down through verse number 8. And it says this: And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When he had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. Now, I want you to notice that there, the winds were contrary. And if you have the study guide, I actually went through in the study guide and put in bold print the different places where the storms were strong and the troubles and the difficulties that they had all along the way. Okay, so all of that is there for you. And I highlighted that for you because I want you to see all the trouble that Paul's having to go through. Verse number 5. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myrna, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Verse 7. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Now, here, I want you to notice some things are happening here. When they came to the port, Paul was being treated differently by Julius. Paul was not your typical prisoner. Paul was just being falsely accused of some things. He wasn't a criminal of the sort of having murdered someone or broken out of prison or jail or anything like that. So Paul was being treated a little bit differently. He was being given favor to go to his friends and let his friends meet the needs that he had. Now it says in verse number 6, a little more history for you here. It says an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy. Now, because of records in antiquity and other historians and stuff, we actually know what this means about the ship. We can understand a little bit about this. Let me give you some of the history about this ship. This ship that Paul would have been on board, it was what was called a grain, as in grain, like we would know today, rice, wheat, and soybeans. In this case, it would have been wheat. This was a grain freighter taking grain grown in Egypt to Italy. So that's where it was headed to. According to a historian, the typical grain freighter of that period was between 140 feet long, was about 140 feet long and 36 feet wide. It had one mast with a big square sail, and instead of what we think of as a rudder, it was steered by two paddles at the stern or the rear of the ship, on the back part of the ship. They were sturdy, but because of its design, it could not sail into the wind like most other ships could. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea of what Paul is aboard. So this would have been a ship that was laden down with grain. It was a grain freighter, plus 276 souls aboard this ship. Okay. And you see all the trouble that they were having, going all the way down to make it into Fair Havens. Okay, let's pick up in verse number 9. Let's read verses 9 and 10. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, now notice Paul is advising the captain, the Julius, the centurion, all of these, the sailors, all the people that were part of this ship. Look in verse 10. Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Paul's giving them a warning here. Now, something I want to mention about that is this. First of all, it says in verse number 9 here, look at it. It says, now when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over. A little more history for you. This fast day, the fast date in question that we're talking about here, was probably October the 5th, which was the date of the Day of Atonement in AD 59. Okay, the idea is that as winter approached, the weather became more dangerous for sailing. And according to F.F. Bruce, the dangerous season for sailing began September 14 and lasted until November 11. After the latter date, all navigation on the open sea came to an end until winter was over with. And Paul knew this, and because Paul knew this, he was warning them about what would happen. Now, he wasn't just warning them about it, but he was actually warning them about it from experience, actually. Write this verse down for yourself there. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. What that tells us is that Paul wrote this, 2 Corinthians 11, 25, previous to this encounter in Acts 27. And when Paul wrote this, he is explaining some of the hardships that he has been through. Listen to this. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Okay, a night and a day I have been in the deep. In other words, a whole night and a day he had been on the ocean, just floating around after a shipwreck. So Paul is saying here that before this encounter, he'd been shipwrecked 3 times, and you'll see before the night's over with, he's about to get shipwreck number 4 put on his record because of what's about to happen to this ship. Okay, so just wanted you to grab a hold of that as we're studying through here. Let's continue. Verse number 11. This is where they're making now the decision. Do they listen to Paul or the captain? Let's read it, verse 11 and 12. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Okay, so the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, he listened to the helmsman, listened to the captain, dismissed Paul, listened to the owner of the ship, dismissed what Paul had to say, and they were going to push on from there and go to another place to try to get to a place called Phoenix so that they could winter there because they felt like that would be a safer port. Now, that Paul's made it from Caesarea to Fair Havens. Now let's look at our second block. Paul's now going to travel from Fair Havens to Malta. Fair Havens to Malta. Let's read verses 13 through 16. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close to Crete. But not long after, in other words, when they first set out, the winds were just fine. There was no storms. And they're like, all right, good decision. Really glad that we did this. It says, verse 14, but not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Okay. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. Okay, a few things I want you to know here to notice here is that at first they set out, and then all of a sudden, then the storm rolled in. Then the storm came in. The storm got so bad they were having a hard time securing the skiff. A skiff would have been a smaller boat. We'd refer to it as like a lifeboat. In those days, sometimes there would be a small skiff that would stay on the water next to the boat for emergency situations, but would be tied to the boat. And so you could easily, if you had to jump overboard or if you had to exit the ship quickly because of maybe it had been attacked and it was sinking fast or something, you'd be able to jump into the water and make it to the skiff so that you could be rescued. Also, the skiff would be used sometimes to row onto the beach up to the island, because many ships a lot of times would go to coastlines and island group areas and stuff where there was no place to actually dock. And so they would use a skiff to go to and from. And Luke is here recording for you and I that they were in a terrible storm, so much so they had a hard time securing the skiff. Okay, let's continue in verse 17 through 19, because that's going to show us how bad this storm really is, because they have to take drastic measures to try to save the ship. Okay, verse 17. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. So notice this, they're trying to keep the ship from falling apart, from just being torn apart by the storm. So they're trying to secure it with cables. It says in verse number 17, to undergird the ship. Fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest tossed, in other words, that's just verbiage for saying a really bad storm that they were in, being tossed everywhere. The next day, they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So I want you to notice what all they did to try to save this, to keep this ship from falling apart. They were trying to undergird it with cables to keep the sides of it and the boards and everything intact so it wouldn't be broken apart because of the storm. That wasn't even enough. Then it says they tried to lighten the load. They began to get rid of things on the boat that would help it to not go under so quickly or to be banged around so much. And then on the third day, that wasn't good enough, and they began throwing the tackle overboard. In other words, this would have been the equipment that was needed on board to function best. But it was so heavy and took up so much space, would bring damage to the ship. They were even throwing that overboard, according to verse number 19. So that's how they lighten the ship. Now, look at all this, all these storms that they're going through. Don't forget about that difficult travel from Caesarea to Fair Havens. Now leaving Fair Havens, trying to get to Phoenix, which they will actually end up in Malta, but trying to get to Phoenix. Storms so bad, they were taking these drastic measures to try to save the ship. Notice the impact that it had on them personally. Look in verse number 20. It says this. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Now, notice it didn't say a few days, but it said no sun and no stars. Now, in the day of Paul, sailors, helmsmen, they had to navigate by the stars at night, by the direction of the sun during the day. They needed these things to navigate, know the right direction they're going, knowing where they're going. And it says here that for many days, there was no stars and no sun, and no small tempest, verse 28, beat on us. All hope that we would be saved was finally given up. So all of this time from Caesarea to now past Fair Havens on the way to Phoenix, they at least had a glimmer of hope that they're going to make it. But now after many days with no sun, no moon, no stars, nothing but storms, it says that all hope was gone. All of it, not just a little bit. No one had hope of any kind. They had all completely given up. 276 people, and not a single one of them had hope. It had been completely lost. Notice how it says in verse 20, it says this, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Now I want you to notice here, Luke is writing, and listen to how he says it. He says, and hope that he's speaking about himself, that we would be saved was finally given up. Luke himself was even given up. He was probably thinking to himself, this is the last thing I'm going to write about Paul. This is the last thing I'm going to write about his journey and about what God is doing in our lives. That's the kind of hopelessness that was taking place. Now, Paul's going to speak up now. In the middle of hopelessness, Paul is going to share with them hope. He's going to give them hope. Look in verse 21 and 22. But after a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, now, it wasn't that they didn't have food. Remember, this is a grain freighter. Possibly some of the food, most of the food maybe have started going bad, maybe because of the conditions that they were in. Most likely, even the most experienced sailor on this ship probably was very seasick. And having lived on the ship myself for 3 years, 8 months, and 2 days while I was in the United States Navy, I can relate to that. And so anyways, Paul says this, verse 21, but after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. Pause right there. That's verse 21. Okay, I love Paul. Paul could not help himself but slip in one of these, I told you so. Paul's just trying to say, look, I tried sharing this with you. This is happening. Now, it was less to poke the bear, and it was less about him trying to be superior. It was less about him trying to appear to be a know-it-all and nobody else knew anything, as much as it was to grab their attention, because he's getting ready to point them to God as being the source of hope and everything else that they would need. So let's continue. Verse 22. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. I love this. It says that all hope had been gone. Nobody had any hope. And then Paul stands up and says, I urge you to take heart. I urge you to take heart. Finally, someone stands up and says, look, hope is not all gone. Even in the midst of what appears to be the worst storm ever, there can be hope. I'd like for those of you on the other side of the screen to think about one of those moments in your life where we would call it a dark night of the soul, or one of those worst moments you've ever been, or anything that you were going through and you just wondered if you'd ever get through it. And somewhere in the midst of all of that, God has sent you a messenger of hope, someone that said, take heart, someone that urged you to take heart, someone that urged you that you're going to get through it, that you're going to make it, that God's going to bring you through it, maybe even drag you through it if he has to. That's what Paul is offering them here when we read that in verse 22. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Now, Paul's going to tell them, beginning in verse number 23, about this angelic visit that he had. Now, we don't know anything else about it. We only know the words of Paul. We don't know if it took place while Paul was sleeping. We don't even know if it was in a dream, that God used a dream, an angel in a dream to speak to him. We don't know if an angel actually physically appeared to him. We just know the words of Paul here. But Paul, now that he's got their attention, told them the ship is going to be lost, but no lives will be lost. Now that Paul has told them that they can take heart, now that Paul has told them that everything's going to be okay, listen to how he explains it. Now that he's got their attention, now that he told them, hey, if you would have listened to me, we wouldn't be in this situation. He did all of that for a reason. It was for these few verses right here, verse 23. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. I want to spend just a few minutes here because this is a powerful turn of events in this story. Here, all hope is lost. Paul stands up and says, I urge you to take heart. Why could he do that? Because now he's going to tell them this night an angel, he says in verse number 23, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. I want you to notice this. Paul was letting them know right up front, look, there is a God. I know him and he knows me. I serve him because he is the God of my life. He is the one that was speaking to me through this angel in this dark moment that we're in. And the words that were spoken to me was this: do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Not some, but all those who sail with you. So even the most faint-hearted of individuals on that boat, even the one that is the most seasick and just wishes life would end right now and get the misery over with, all of a sudden can take heart because God said all of them will be saved. Then he says this, therefore take heart, men. So notice the bookends. He told them to take heart, told them the story about the angel and what God said, and now he's talking about taking heart again. Notice the connection here. Take heart in the middle of nobody having any hope at all, tells them the story of what the angel said that God said. Then he says this, therefore is what? always there for a reason. Therefore, what I just told you about, you can take heart, men. And he says this, for I believe God. I want you to notice he didn't say, I believe in God, though Paul does believe in God. He's saying, I believe God. I believe what God had to say. I believe what God had to say. Listen to me, focus with me right here for a minute, especially those of you that are watching this that are discouraged. It seems like you're facing trouble around every corner. It seems like nothing is going right in your life. You've held that figurative towel 100 times in the last week and just wanted to throw it in and just give up on everything. Listen to me. Listen close to me. Right here, Paul is saying this. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God. What he was saying is this. I believe what God said is true. And I believe God. And if God said he's going to do it, he will do it. And you need to have that same kind of belief also. Not just a belief in God, but a belief that God will do what he said to do. Listen to me. God's a promise maker and he's a promise keeper. And if God has said it, it will happen. But this is what Satan tries to do. Satan tries to convince you in the midst of your difficulty in life that that Bible verse that God's trying to stir your soul with, that he's trying to do something in your life with, that Satan's trying to convince you and twist that around and make you think that God means that verse is for everybody else but you. And I'm here to tell you it's not true. It is your word from God. I'll never forget the deepest, darkest moment in my entire life. I remember God coming to me with a verse out of the book of Proverbs, chapter 23. And that verse said this. I could see it in my Bible, in my mind's eye, on the pages of my Bible. I reached over, got my Bible, opened it up, and right there it was. And this is what it says. For surely there's a future ahead of you, and your hope will not be disappointed. It was as if God told the writer of Proverbs to write that verse. And when he wrote that verse, he said, this is going to be for Jonathan Wright. Jonathan Wright's going to need this. And I knew that within my heart. But guess what? The enemy came in like a flood and tried to steal that from me and tried to make me think or make me doubt that that was not for me, that that was for everybody but me. And I remember in order to fight those doubts, I reached over on the printer and pulled down a bunch of pieces of paper. And I wrote that verse real big on every piece of paper. Every piece of paper was on that stack. And I just walked around the room and I taped one on the back of the door. I taped one on the mirror. I taped one on the computer monitor. I taped one on the wall next to the mattress that I was sleeping on. I taped it all over the place. I folded one up and put it in my pocket. And I remember as I fell asleep that night, holding my Bible and clutching one of those pieces of paper that had that verse on it. Why? Because it was God's word for me. And it was true for me. And I believe that God meant it when he said that there's a future ahead of me and my hope will not be disappointed. And guess what? Every word of that verse has come true in my life. Was it still dark days after that? There were a lot of dark days still after that. But I can tell you, it might have been dark. It might have been painful. It might have been hurtful for the night. But joy did finally come in the morning. And God began to show me deliverance and begin to set me free from these difficulties that I've been ensnared in. And I'm just here to tell you, folks, that's what God wants to do for you. That's what Paul was trying to do for these men on the ship. Point them to God and say, I believe God. Listen to the verse again, verse 25. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. Then he says this, look in verse number 26. However, we must run aground on a certain island. I picture a bunch of them going, Paul, which island? I mean, which island is going to be? And Paul was like, well, I don't know. God didn't tell me that part. But what he did tell me, I believe in it 100%. I know exactly what it's going to be. All right, let's continue. Verse number 27 says this. Now we're going to see here where they're beginning to get close to land. Verse 27 says this. Now, when the 14th night had come, notice that this is 2 weeks later. Okay, this isn't just a couple of hours or something. 2 weeks later, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors, from the stern and prayed for day to come. So notice here, they think they're close to land, but they think they're going to crash the boat. And so they throw anchors in. And now notice those who had no hope before now are beginning to take heart, now are beginning to believe that there even is a God in heaven above. And now they're spending the night praying. And what are they praying for? It says here that they prayed for day to come. In other words, for it to come and for it to come quickly for them. Okay, that leads us down. Let's continue verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape, it says, I'm sorry, I went too far. Verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. So some were trying to trick everyone and say, we're just putting out the rudders. We're just putting out a few things. But they were going to quietly try to secretly get in the skiff and get away from the ship before it crashed and escape. And Paul warned them about this. And they began now to listen to Paul. And they caught these men and made them stay on board. Okay. Now, Paul begins now in verse 33 to encourage the passengers and the crew now that dawn is coming. Notice verse 3. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. I love that part. Paul encouraged them. But bigger than that, I want you to notice that even in the midst of all these storms and all these things that were going on, Paul was able to take and break bread and thank God for it. What a wonderful thing. What a wonderful thing. Some of you need that tonight. You need to know that right in the middle of your storm, you actually can still thank God, because you may say you've lost everything, but you've not lost everything. I've been in a place in my life where I've almost lost everything, but I've always still had something. And I've discovered that when I can thank God for that something, it changes me inside my heart. It builds my most holy faith, draws me close to God, causes me to have faith to believe for bigger things in my life. That's what was going on here. Verse 39, it goes on and shows us how the ship ran aground. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile losing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow struck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. This is like an epic tale that you would read in a book late at night of all the adventures that they've already had out to sea. And now they're finding themselves shipwrecked. And this is Paul's fourth shipwreck that's going to happen in his life. Fourth shipwreck. He's been through a great deal. Paul experienced a lot in this chapter where he was navigating these storms, making it from Caesarea to Fair Havens, and Fair Havens now to what we know when we read in chapter 28, verse 1 is the island of Malta. Okay? Now, this is where I told you the learning gold was at. It's at the end of this lesson. So let's get to it. It's at the very end of your study guide. If you don't have a study guide, I'll read this so you can write it down. This is the most important part of the lesson all night long. The things that we've learned before was just so we could learn the story, know what happened, and now we're going to apply it. Three things I want to share with you. Three keys here for you and I to better navigate the storms of life that we learn from Paul's experience. Number one is this: storms will come. Storms will come. Paul, let me read his list for you again. Paul shares a list of his sufferings as an apostle of God in 2 Corinthians 11:25. Listen to it again. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Think about that. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and that was now it's 4 times he's been shipwrecked. Then he says, a night and a day I have been in the deep. Paul, previous to this, had survived 3 shipwrecks, not 1, not 2, 3 shipwrecks. Obviously, that is teaching you and I this: even those called by God to do great things for God, to share the word of God, to reach entire villages and cities and areas with the gospel of Jesus Christ, even those individuals are not exempt from trials and sufferings in life. Paul even said it himself right before he died when he wrote 2 Timothy. He said, all who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. One Bible teacher put it this way, and I've learned after 59 years, I'm more agree with it now than ever before. No one escapes this human experience without some level of pain and suffering. Doesn't matter if you're a believer or not a believer. You're going to experience trials and troubles. And you need to know that, because otherwise Satan will get the best of you. He'll come along and go, how come you're the only one that has trials and troubles? How come you couldn't be like Paul the Apostle? Well, hello. After reading this list, I don't know that I want to be like Paul the Apostle. 4 shipwrecks, stoned once, 3 times beaten with rods. He spent a day and a night in the deep, hanging probably onto whatever piece of wood or something that was left from the ship to try to survive. Even Jesus told us himself, write this down, John 16:33. I'm going to read it to you from the Amplified, where he said this: in the world you have trouble, you have tribulation and distress and suffering. But be courageous, be confident, be undaunted, be filled with joy. I have overcome the world. We can't always predict when the storms are going to come, and we sure can't outrun them. Paul tried to outrun this along with the helmsman to Phoenix, and they could not outrun the storm. But we can navigate the storms of life when we anchor ourselves to Jesus Christ, when we believe God, not just believe in God, but believe that God is true and his word will true. Storms will come, but we can draw closer to God and make it through them. So, number 1, storms will come. Number 2, storms reveal our faith. Storms reveal our faith, either how much we have or how little we have. Storms will reveal our faith. What's inside of you will come out in the storms of life. What by your response, by what you listen to, the advice that you listen to, the actions that you take. Notice even in the life of Julius, the centurion here, Julius initially listened to the owner of the ship and the helmsman or the pilot over Paul's advice. Natural response: Paul's a tent maker and a prisoner. These other guys were the helmsman and the owner of the ship, so he listened to them. But later on, when disaster happened that Paul had predicted, Julius shifted his attention to listening to Paul. But in the midst of all of that, people began to panic. They were fearful, and all of them had lost hope. Yet Paul, in the midst of being surrounded by people hopeless, Paul listened to the voice of God and received assurance of the outcome of the storm that he was in. And you and I can have the same thing also. No matter what storms we face, storms will reveal our faith, either how much you have or how little of it that you have. Third and final one that I want you to see here, a third key to helping you and I navigate the storms of life. First of all, storms will come, number 1. Number 2, storms reveal our faith, how much we have or how little we have. And number 3, storms reposition us. Storms reposition us. See, when the storm is over, Paul was not in the same place. Storms move ships, and storms in your life figuratively will move you. It will move you. You see, a ship, one of the things I learned by being in the Navy, every time a storm, now it had to be a storm of a certain category or greater, But after it reached a certain level of danger, the storm, like the certain amount of winds and how high the waves would be coming in, we would have to leave the pier and set out to sea. I'll never forget when Hurricane Diana came through. I believe it was 1984. I remember that Norfolk was going to suffer drastically from it, and they sent the entire Navy out to sea. And I was a brand new sailor, and I thought, this makes no sense to me. Why in the world are we going out to meet the storm instead of staying in the port? Because if we'd stayed anchored to the pier, it would have beaten our ship against the pier. And in some cases, with some ships, could cause them to suffer damage to the hull, take on water, and begin to sink. Ships were never meant to be docked in a storm, they were meant to weather the storm. You and I are the same thing too. We don't stay stationary in the storms of life. We get tossed to and fro, and storms will reposition us. You see, the storm brought Paul to a new place. The storm brought Paul to a new place. Figuratively, the storms in people's lives have always put them and repositioned them in a new place for ministry, a new calling in their life, a new purpose for serving God. Let me give you just two examples. One would be Moses in the Old Testament. Moses was raised in a palace. He became a fugitive and then a shepherd. Following many years of struggle, God called him to lead more than 1 million Israelites to freedom. The storms in his life repositioned him so that he could be used in a different way by God. See, we misunderstand sometimes the storms that are allowed in our lives. God's allowed it because he's trying to reposition us for a new ministry, a new calling, or a new purpose, or a different purpose in our life. Another example would be David. David's facing a giant named Goliath repositioned him. A mere shepherd boy, he then became a great warrior and a king. From shepherd boy to warrior and king, he was repositioned by the storm that was brought into his life. So God sometimes will use storms to reposition us for his call and purposes in our life. And it's up to us to anchor ourselves to God during those difficult times. I want to pray with you, for you, and over you right now, especially for those of you that are going through storms in life right now. So there on the other side of this screen, whether you're on demand or on live with me right now, I want you right now to pray with me, to ask God to help you in the middle of this storm, to bring you the answer you need. Just like the angel went and gave a word to Paul, that God would give you a word and that he'd bring you through this storm, that you would see what it's for, the purpose behind it, what it can accomplish in your life. Let's pray together. God, we don't always understand these things. Paul didn't even understand all the details. Paul had an angel come and tell him that the ship was going to go aground, but the angel didn't even tell him where it would go aground, what island, what place. But he did tell him that all of them would survive. And what little bit he'd been told by God was enough that he believed God, that God would do exactly what he said he would do. So I'm asking for every person on the other side of this screen that's struggling right now. They're in the middle of an extreme difficulty in their life, maybe even feeling like this is the end of all days for them, that they just don't know how they'll ever weather this storm, God. Come into the midst of that storm, Father, and begin to speak to them just like the angel spoke to Paul for you, God. Let them have that and give them a word from you, God. And we're going to thank you for this. In your name we pray. Amen and amen. Hey, I want to encourage you. This is one of those kind of Bible lessons that I believe has the potential to encourage many people. I'd like to encourage you then to put it on your Facebook page, on your Instagram, on your different social medias. Get the link and text it to somebody or email the link to somebody and let's share it. On a personal note, I'd like to say thank you. I mentioned last week in the broadcast it was going to be my birthday the next day. Many of you have sent me text messages, giving me cards and gifts and phone calls and messages that you put on my different social medias, Instagram and Facebook and those kind of things. And I just want to thank you for your kindness toward me. It's been, when I say overwhelming, I mean in a very good way, how much you've loved on me. So thank you for that. It's one of the things that Pastor Dan and I love about serving you is that we really are one really big family. So, on speaking of Pastor Dan, on behalf of our Pastor Dan, his wife Esther, myself, and my wife Lola, we want to say thank you for your kindness, your goodness toward us. And we also want to thank you for your commitment to the Word of God, to learning it, to finding ways to apply it in your life. And you've shown that through joining us week after week in these broadcasts. Next week, we'll be in Acts chapter 28. That'll be the final one for this season. We'll take a summer pause. We'll give you the dates over the summer of the restart date when we take the pause off in the fall, late summer, early fall, and what new series that we will be jumping into. But next week, we wrap up the book of Acts, Acts chapter 28. Paul finds himself on the island of Malta. God bless you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Don't forget, let's share this encouragement that we've all learned tonight and let other people be encouraged by it. God bless you. Have a wonderful week. See you soon. Bye now.